Let's get started with reviewing for exam one. I will circle certain things as we go through the slides. In some cases, I'm just going to tell you, you need to make sure you understand what the book says on this subject, but the goal of this video is to point you in some very specific directions to make you understand some very specific things. Now, I may glance down from time to time because what I'm doing is checking to make sure I've covered all of the exam questions. So I guarantee you in this video, I am going to touch on either by being very specific or pointing you to a particular section of the book, what exactly you need to know for the exam. Remember, it'll be 40 multiple choice questions. I'll tell you there are relatively fewer questions out of chapter one than there are out of chapters 2, 3, and 4. So a little bit lighter in chapter one. 30 of the 40 questions are directly from the question bank. 10 of the questions are ones that I have written. And again, I cover them very clearly. I've covered them very clearly in class, and I will be talking about them in this review video. So let's dive in. Even though I'm not that big on you knowing definitions, it's probably going to really help you to understand the definition of competitive advantage and of above average returns. Definitely you're going to want to know the definition of above average returns. And remember, I emphasize that the end product of strategy is performance, that ultimately this is about why some firms outperform others. Therefore, the end step of a strategy process is performance. Nothing on position trade-off fit. Nothing on hyper competition. Make sure that you understand that the two general thoughts of strategy are the IO theory and also know its assumptions. And this chart, likewise for the resource-based view, its assumptions, its chart as well. Understand the difference between a vision statement and a mission statement. There are at least two, maybe even three questions on stakeholders. So know who is in the stakeholders, but I'm also going to use this topic to point out that I'm picking a lot of the multiple choice questions from the question file that ask you to apply things. So I'll tell you specifically on the stakeholder question, not only are you going to have to know the definitions, but you're going to have to tie them to the broader concept of what strategy is about. So, and that's true of a lot of questions. And I'll be pointing things out like it's not so much specific, studying a specific thing as is understanding the concept because you're going to have to apply it. And that's it for chapter one. Pause while I change the slides. Chapter two is one of those chapters where there really aren't that many definitions, although I'll give you some specific pointers where you're really going to remember what the book said. There is a whole lot of applications, so it's important that you understand these concepts. Remember, the general environment is the big picture, then the industry environment, and make sure that you know the definition of what constitutes an industry, and it's right out of the textbook, so make sure you know that definition. Porter's five forces, and then the competitive environment are the big concepts, and these are all heavily tested. As far as the general environment goes, know that these are hard to predict. They're even harder to try to control, but also make sure that you go through each of these and understand what constitutes each of these. So there's a little bit of a sneaky question about economic, and there's some in the other areas as well. So pay particular attention to making sure you know what constitutes the economic environment. Porter's five forces, I can't tell you exactly what to study. There's probably a total of 5 questions that touch on Porter's five forces. Do make sure that you understand each of these concepts. In other words, what does constitute a threat of new entrants in all of these things? There's a question about differentiation. There's a question about what constitutes economies of scale. So make sure you read the textbook closely to understand this. All of these concepts, you need to understand this because all of these concepts are going to be tested as far as the 5 Porter forces and their impact. So I can't emphasize enough, make sure you understand Porter's 5 forces thoroughly. There's probably 5 questions. Also, don't forget complementors. Moving forward, nothing about my war story, nothing about that, nothing on strategic groups. There are some questions on, there is a question on competitor analysis and competitive intelligence. So make sure that you're up on that. There's a question on what constitutes forecasting. And That's it for chapter 2. But again, very important that you know Porter's 5 forces extremely well and that you have a good understanding of the IO view of competitive advantage. On to chapter 3. Like chapter 2, the key to getting a lot of the questions right for chapter 3 is to understand the underlying concept. Make sure you understand the definition of customer value, namely that willingness to pay is a big element of that. On this chart, these are the key concepts. The idea of the 4 criteria of sustainable competitive advantage, and then the value chain analysis. This is where the bulk of the chapter is and what is heavily tested. Nothing on this chart. Resources. What are the differences between tangible and intangible? Know which is which, be able to identify which is which, and also be able to talk about why intangible resources are seen as a greater contributor to competitive advantage. Understand this table. I don't want to just say know it. I want to tell you to understand it. You're going to see some words off of this, and there's going to be some word questions they're going to set up to say, can you recognize when these conditions are present? So you've just got to understand this concept and how it applies. There are some questions about, or at least a question about these different ways that make it difficult to imitate. But again, take the time to reread the chapter and make sure you understand these concepts. Nothing about VRIO. Value chain. Again, make sure you reread this part of the chapter. There's 2 or 3 questions that talk about the value chain, and also 2 questions about outsourcing. Make sure you understand why outsourcing is often a good idea for most companies. That for sure is one of the questions. But again, if you read the chapter and you follow the concepts of what we've talked about in class, you're going to be in great shape. And that's it for, lastly, chapter 4. And again, I know I'm starting to sound perhaps a bit redundant, but it's important for you to understand all 5 of the generic strategies and understand the pros and the cons to each. There are, again, probably 5 to 7 questions that get into these generic strategies, and you have to understand what they mean because there are a lot of application multiple choice questions where there's going to be words in the question stem that, for example, should trigger in your mind that they're running a cost leadership strategy, and then they're going to have you talk about what are some of the pros and the cons or what makes it a strong position. So hopefully you followed the discussion in class. If so, frankly, if you understand the class discussion, you're going to be in great shape here because there's a lot of application that goes on. So, know what kind of product a cost leader offers. Understand the ways in the value chain that it often takes out cost. Understand the pathways to higher profits for a cost leader. Understand that in a cost leadership strategy, although all elements of the value chain are important, often logistics play a particularly large role in a cost leadership strategy to generate the competitive advantage. Understand why it's a strong position. In other words, why can it better resist higher costs from suppliers? Why can it better resist demands from buyers as opposed to their competitors? Likewise, entrants and substitutes. All these 2 are the primary ones where people have to be up on that. So now let's go to differentiation. Know what are the bases for differentiation, and this is a very important concept, that competitive advantage only comes through a differentiation strategy when it costs you X dollars to input that measure of differentiation, and it actually, by customers' willingness to pay for that feature differentiation, it vastly increases your profit margin over what it is without that differentiation. Or simply put, they have to pay much more for it than it costs you to put it in. Again, understand the value chain trade-offs and what sorts of value chain activities might be emphasized more in a differentiation strategy. Once again, understand how these forces work with a differentiation strategy, and understand that the key is often the high loyalty, which gives them power against buyers because they prefer it, power against suppliers because they can absorb price increases. all those sorts of things. Also, what mistakes can a differentiator make? Focus strategies. I'm not sure that I ask a question specifically about the focus strategies, but be up on that. Integrated cost leadership strategy. There is at least one question on that, and it centers around the fact that this is often the most difficult to execute. It's also perhaps one of the strongest strategies when it's executed well. So lots of questions out of chapter 4, and they're very much application questions about the strengths and weaknesses of the various strategies. So just again to reiterate what you should do to study. You're already doing something smart. You're watching this review video. Now go pay attention to the points I've highlighted in the slides. I've pointed to every question on the exam where I've told you just have to understand the concept, make sure you review the slides, your class notes, and go back and reread the parts of the textbook. If you've taken the quizzes twice and you follow my advice, you're going to find the exam very straightforward and very easy. If you don't, you're not. But I want to back up and say this exam, even though it's multiple choice, probably a third of the multiple choice questions are application questions. You're not going to just rote memorize them. You're going to have to know the concept, unless of course you've seen the question during the one of the quizzes and you've memorized the answer to the question, which is why I tell you to take the quizzes twice. Okay, I'm repeating myself. Good luck studying. Please don't hate me for making you take the exam on the Monday after the Super Bowl, and we'll get on to the next thing.